All rise. We will be. Please be seated.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garcia. Please continue.
Alors, Monsieur le témoin, on s'est...
Mr. Witness, we have been talking about the ODM ever since yesterday. Now I would like to talk about the Party of National Unity, that is the PNU, in 2007 during the presidential elections. You were asked these questions for your expert report, and that (0098087500931313) in the English version of this same report. Now, very briefly, explain to us the origin of the PNU in 2007. Answer. This was a partisan structure that was put in place to enable Mwai Kibaki to be re-elected. So the party appeared after the referendum of 2005, during which Kibaki realized that there was a lot of catching up to do because he had failed to win in the swing communities. Nevertheless, he was still popular, and he knew that he had a good chance of winning the election. And he had started campaigning with NAC Kenya, which was led by Raphael Tuju at one point and another leader. So this was a party that did not function correctly. There was no membership drive. There were no internal elections. And very quickly, the Kibaki camp realized that another party had to be set up. And it was in August 2007 that he put in place the PNU. The PNU is very peculiar because it was an alliance set up exclusively for the presidential election. On paper, it was an alliance of parties that had a pretty good coverage of the country. And you had two parties from Gema, two Luya parties, Fort Kenya and New Fort Kenya. You had a party from the coast, Shirikisho, and you had Kanu from the Rift Valley. So, in principle, this was a party that was supposed to cover the entire territory, except that this is not what happened. I can see that you have Mueller's article in the file, and he stated that it was a party that was non-programmatic in its manifesto. It had a lot of money, but was very loosely organized, and everything was sort of improvised. Nevertheless, they were able to come up with a manifesto, with a program. I don't know whether you want to know about that. Question. We would prefer that you tell us who was part of the PNU for the elections of 2007. Answer. So the PNU was made up mainly of the two Gema parties, then Fort Kenya, New Fort Kenya, Fort People, Shirikisho, KANU, and a series of small parties, Safina, Fort Asili, and so on and so forth. So there was a large number of very small parties. Question. You have said that KANU was a member of this PNU alliance. Was it the entire leadership of KANU at that time, or was KANU split between PNU and ODM? Answer. Yes, of course, KANU at that time was split. Some of the leaders supported ODM, while others had joined the Kibaki camp, that is the PNU. The KANU faction that joined PNU was the Moi and Biwott faction. Uhuru Kenyatta joined that camp as from September 2007. So certain cynical people said that this was an operation to safeguard the family fortunes of the two dynasties of the two former presidents. But it is true that the fact that Uhuru Kenyatta joined that camp was totally unexpected, because ever since 2002 he was clearly in the opposition, and during the referendum of 2005 he carried out a brilliant campaign against the constitutional reform project. The fact that he joined Kibaki at the end was very surprising. Question. You have mentioned the KANU leaders who supported PNU. Can you tell us about the KANU leaders who supported ODM during the 2007 elections? Answer. Regarding KANU leaders who participated in the PNU campaign, well, this was the entire faction belonging to Moi and Biwott. That is the elders, the Kalenjin elders who belonged to KANU. Not all of them had failed to win the elections in 2002, but they were trying to revive their careers, and they joined the Kibaki camp. Question. Very well, but were there any KANU members at the time who supported the ODM? Answer. Yes. There was a group of people who had come from the Ruto faction and who were clearly supporters of the ODM. And as we were saying a short while ago, there were no official defections from those parliamentarians. That is, they did not officially leave. They did not officially leave KANU. Question. You talked about NAC and the fact that Mwai Kibaki was the leader of NAC. Can you explain to us how this NAC political party came about, and how is it related to the PNU? Answer. NAC was created in 2002. Up to that point, Kibaki has used the Democratic Party for his electoral campaigns, and at that time he took his DP party to join the NAC alliance, and he started by bringing into his camp people who had been candidates in 97 at the presidential election, Charity Ngilu and Wamalwa, and who no longer had the financial resources to run in 2002. Kibaki had the support of strong economic forces, particularly in 2002. His camp had a lot of money at their disposal, so he could finance the campaign of a multitude of candidates. And at the end of 2002, when Uhuru Kenyatta was nominated as the presidential candidate for KANU, all the KANU leaders who would have wanted to be candidates themselves jumped ship from KANU and joined that new alliance, which was to be known as NAC. They signed a power-sharing agreement which was supposed to prepare for the elections. NAC was to survive until the elections, but after that it became almost totally inexistent, including during by-elections from 2002 to 2005. There was a resurgence of an offshoot of NAC, which was known as NAC Kenya, which was set up as from June 2006. Question, you have mentioned NAC. What does that acronym stand for? Answer, I no longer remember. It is just a party name. Question, very well. We are going to come back to that later.
If you have that, you can put it on the record.
Je crois, Monsieur le témoin n'est-il pas...
Mr. Witness, was that not the National Rainbow Coalition? Witness, yes, I believe so. Question, we are going to come back to 2007. Now, in 2007, for the presidential elections, there was Mwai Kibaki, who was running on the PNU ticket, and then on the other side, you had Raila Odinga. Now, regarding ODM, Raila Odinga was the one running for president on the ODM ticket. What was his team like? You have talked about the Pentagon. What is it all about? Answer. The Pentagon was an informal name for the leadership structure of the ODM responsible for conducting the electoral campaign. So in 2007, there were general elections, including civic elections, parliamentary elections, and presidential elections. There were different structures for each of these elections within the ODM. At the level of the presidential elections, when the primaries were conducted, Raila Odinga emerged as the candidate of the party, but he was skillful enough to bring in some of his competitors who were very influential in the other regions. So he brought them into this informal leadership structure, the Pentagon. They included a good number of regional bigwigs. So you had Mudavadi for the Luyas, you had Balala for the coast, you had Nyaga for the Embus, you had Ruto for the Kalenjins, and Charity Ngilu for the Kambas.
We know that we're happy to have the real-time transcript back on. It had been off for a while, and during that time, the reference was made to the acronym NAC. We see it spelled N-A-K. It should be N-A-R-C.
K. K. K.
A.
Simplement, monsieur le témoin, je crois que
Mr. Garcia. Mr. Witness, I believe that in your report you state NAC, spell it as N-A-R-C. And before NAC was set up, there was another NAC, which was an informal alliance bringing together Mwai Kibaki, Wamalwa, and Charity Ngilu. Now, after the arrival of the KANU bigwigs, they together made up NAC. Question. Thank you for that clarification. You talked about the Pentagon and you stated that Mr. William Ruto was a member of the Pentagon. Can you tell us briefly what his role was within the Pentagon? Answer. There were no specific duties. It was a relatively informal structure. But what was important was that each of these regional leaders had to serve as a spokesperson in his or her region. And programs had been developed that were adapted to each region, and they were supposed to adapt the messages faithfully to the regions. So within this framework, William Ruto was the person responsible in the Rift Valley.
également dans votre
Question. In your expert report, Mr. Witness, you also talked about Mr. Uhuru Kenyatta, and that is question number 4 of your report. The reference in French is 00930881, and in the English version it is 00931319. You were asked about the affiliation of Mr. Uhuru Kenyatta. Can you tell us briefly his party affiliation and how he came about that? Answer. At that time, Uhuru Kenyatta was the leader of KANU. You have to know that elections by delegates took place in 2005. The other candidate was Nicholas Biwott. And Nicholas Biwott created another structure. I'm not sure whether it was within KANU or outside of KANU, but in 2006, other elections were organized and Biwott won. So Uhuru Kenyatta took the issue to court and he was restored to the leadership of KANU. Question. You were asked questions about Mr. Kenyatta, specifically question number 4. You pointed out that even before the elections, the PNU was a party of alliances. I would like you to clarify. I understand that there was a certain degree of support from KANU. Now, were there any members of KANU who wanted also to run for the presidency? Answer, no. KANU was very clearly one of the parties of the alliance, and the candidate for the presidency was never challenged. So this structure was set up for Mr. Kibaki, and the other leaders of the parties of the alliance did not want to challenge Mr. Kibaki because all those parties supported him for re-election. To elaborate, there were certain agreements that were signed. This was an alliance set up for the presidential elections. For example, Uhuru Kenyatta negotiated certain agreements for parliamentary elections, particularly that no other parties of the alliance would stand against him and against other Kanu candidates. So this was done for the parliamentary elections. Question. Once again, Mr. Witness, based on your expert report, 0093083, and in the English version 00931321. It is question number 6, which was put to you about the ODM. There was another question, whether PNU was able to have the support of certain segments of the population in the Rift Valley, that is, for the 2007 election. Can you clarify? Answer. It is easier to talk about the support for the PNU in the central province rather than in the Rift Valley, where they failed woefully. In fact, the business communities who profited from economic growth were the main supporters of the PNU. They accepted to massively finance the elections. They also had some support from the churches, particularly the Catholic Church, which were hostile to Majimbo. There were also the middle classes, which really benefited from the situation after 2000. And during that period, the growth rate created jobs for degree holders. And so this was beneficial to the middle class. Now, regarding the Rift Valley, the support that the PNU received in that area was ethnic-based, and particularly Kikuyu and some Luyas. So you have to know that the voting, particularly support to the PNU in the Rift Valley, was done along ethnic lines. Question. In your report, you distinguish between the two parties at the presidential and parliamentary elections. Was there a clear distinction? Answer. Can you repeat the question? Question. In your report, you talked about a distinction that had to be made between the presidential elections, the parliamentary elections, and the civic elections. Was this important during the elections? Answer. Yes. Within the constituencies, one can say that they were practically homogeneous, and so the ethnic factor really was not important. So it was the infra-ethnic factor Ruto that made it possible for the voters to make a choice. In a certain number of regions, including amongst the population that usually vote as a bloc for the same party, things changed because in this case the PNU was an alliance only for the presidential elections, and so the votes were dispersed in the parliamentary elections amongst a series of parties, and this was very costly to them. There is an analyst who claims that this cost the PNU alliance about 60 seats because the parties were not able to agree with regard to the parliamentary elections. Question. Now, you can also look at this issue from the point of view of the ODM, that is for the 2007 elections. Was there a distinction from the point of view of Kalenjin voting blocks, that is between the presidential, parliamentary and civic elections? Answer. Regarding the Kalenjins of the Rift Valley, they voted more or less as a bloc, both in the presidential and parliamentary elections. In the civic elections, it was a little bit more complicated.
Witness, if I may return you to a matter you mentioned in passing in the last few answers. You say that the Catholic Church was hostile to Majimbo. Was that your testimony? If so, why? What is the explanation for that attitude?
Answer. The Catholic Church in 2007 was relatively hostile to Majimbo, in particularly the hierarchy of the church. They made some very strong statements against Majimbo. You must realize that the Catholic hierarchy at the time was rather Kikuyu. And the Catholic Church has always supported the Kibaki camp quite strongly. So one can read that situation from an ethnic point of view. The Catholic hierarchy spoke out against Majimbo, and in a Luo area, it was said that they were not in agreement with the hierarchy, and they thought that it was not the role of the church to make a statement on that issue. And they themselves individually did not agree with that position that was taken. The Anglicans, it was much the same sort of thing. Somewhat more normal, really, because you see, the Anglicans, the Anglican Church, is very closely linked to development. And that clear position taken against Majimbo was quite surprising, that position taken by the Catholic Church. After the 2008 crisis, the Catholic hierarchy confessed or said that perhaps they had gone beyond, that they had crossed the line and had not played a role of unifying the faithful. So the religious forces were had some regret in relation to their attitude during the election campaign. That can't be denied. The Catholic Church as well, and amongst the Kalenjin, amongst the Nandi in particular, the Catholic Church is somewhat of a separate force, often experiencing conflict with other churches. So it has strong social power, but it isn't truly expressed at the political level.
Would it be or not the case that perhaps, I'm asking so you can help us understand, could the hostility might it be that a certain understanding of Majimbo might cause difficulties? I mean, you testified about how Majimbo might have been understood by some elements, perhaps at the individual level, that it might mean different laws applying to different people in a way that if you reduced it, that might create some sort of difficult situation, if not a dangerous situation. Could that be the explanation for the hostility, or not? Or is it simply because of the ethnic makeup of the Catholic hierarchy?
La question du maître.
Answer. Well, the whole issue of Majimbo and interpretation thereof is extremely complicated insofar as there were several levels of interpretation of Majimbo during that election campaign. There was the form of Majimbo as presented by the political parties. There was the Majimbo presented by civil society, in particular the churches. And then there was the form of Majimbo supported by more local authorities, and perhaps it was perhaps in the way it was understood by the local people. For example, in relation to this topic of Majimbo, the political parties, ODM was very careful. Let me put it differently. The PNU strongly attacked ODM during the election campaign, saying to the people living in the Rift Valley that if you're not Kalenjin, you are going to be chucked out, thrown out. And immediately the ODM spin doctors realized that this was a terrible attack that could lead them to losing a lot of votes in the swing communities, in particularly three groups that are quite present in the Rift Valley. And I believe it was in November 2007, a whole communications campaign was organized by the ODM to explain more about Majimbo. And the Majimbo of the year of the 2000s had nothing to do with past forms of Majimbo. They got that message out there through politicians, basically through politicians, and also through William Ruto. And so he made some statements about Majimbo at that time. However, this is all about political communications at the national level. At the same time, at the local level, there was a different version of Majimbo being put out there, various messages expressed in the Rift Valley by local leaders. It was a different form of Majimbo. All the people who were not from the original communities of the region, and thus civil society never truly believed the ODM operation. They said, watch out, Majimbo, that could actually turn out to be the Majimbo of the 1990s, and we need to avoid that. So you see, everyone was talking about the issue, but at different levels and in different ways. That's why it's such a complex issue.
And what is that Majimbo of the 1990s that civil society was saying, be careful, this thing may turn out to be the Majimbo of the 1990s?
Answer. I don't quite understand the question. Are you asking me?
Okay. You testified that there was an evolution in the discourse as to the meaning of Majimbo, up to the point where the ODM, according to you, using their politicians, tried to send out a message about what they meant by Majimbo. I would presume you meant a message that tried to pacify people, saying, do not be afraid of Majimbo.
Oui.
It's not dangerous. But then you say that despite all of that, the civil society say, be careful everyone, this thing may still turn out to be the Majimbo of the 1990s. That was your testimony. And at this point I would like us to have you say what that Majimbo of the 1990s was, that the civil society said be careful of.
Alors, le Majimbo
Answer. The Majimbo of the 1990s was very clearly ethnic cleansing. Repeated ethnic cleansing that had occurred during all the general elections in the 1990s. Thus, it was the version that all the non-native populations feared. The Majimbo of the 1990s was the ideological rhetoric from Kalenjin Maasai politicians during all the massacres that occurred during that particular period of time. Of course, ODM had difficulty convincing people that their version of Majimbo was in no way related to the Majimbo of the 1990s, owing to the fact that at the local level, everyone knew that those messages of hate were being constantly being passed on by local community leaders. All the wording that I've seen, all the writings by Lynch, for example, and others, there was a great deal of ambiguity when it came to the Majimbo message, and at the local level there was a message of hate. The difficulty analyzing this is that there's no proposals for interpretation. All the same, one could assume that perhaps that tasks would be distributed in the political community with, on the one hand, elected officials amongst the Kalenjin in the Rift Valley and local community leaders, convincing the people to vote for them, using these hate message. On the other hand, members of Parliament would have to handle communication with people outside the Rift Valley, and they would have to tone down the concerns and the fears, or soften the fears of the people in the Rift Valley. So the rhetoric depended whether people were speaking in Kalenjin, in English, in native languages. All the human rights NGOs explained that Kalenjin politicians at peace rallies use that technique. In Swahili, they would say, you must stop fighting. In Kalenjin, they would say, keep on fighting. So this classic technique of political people is to adjust one's rhetoric to the particular population in question or audience. So there was this dual rhetoric going on. This is an interpretation that I see when I read the authors who have written on this topic.
On the Catholic Church and their attitude towards Majimbo. You see, they don't have their lawyer in the courtroom. But if their lawyer were in the courtroom and said to you, well, the reason why the Catholic Church was not too hot with the idea of Majimbo might be because they were afraid that some people might understand it to mean ethnic cleansing, and not merely because the Catholic Church hierarchy was Kikuyu. What would you say to that?
Yes, oui, je...
Answer. Yes, I quite agree. No doubt. There were substantial reasons to be opposed to such a policy, and very solid justification existed behind their arguments. The problem is that the Catholics always, well, the political discourse of Catholic leaders was such that but yet they were involved in election campaigns of Kibaki and a whole series of members of parliament close to Kibaki. The support was so clear for Kibaki that necessarily the marching orders and of the Catholic Church was colored by these ethnic considerations. This is how we can see it.
Yes, please. Sorry to have interrupted your questioning. Proceed, please.
Alors, Monsieur Maupe,
Mr. Garcia, sir, I'd like to refer you to question number 1 in your expert report. And just for the case file, this is 0093-0871 French version, and the corresponding English is 0093 is 0871. And this is one of the most important questions, and you've made reference to this point several times during your testimony, and you're really going into great depth. Now, the question was, what were the root causes of the post-election violence that followed the 2007 elections? Inaudible.
Can we have the English reference again, please?
c'est la question numéro 1.
Mr. Garcia, 0093-0871 of the expert report prepared by Mr. Maupu. 0093-0871.
Do we have 0871 in English?
I'm sorry, that's the French version. Désolé. Alors, la référence.
Mr. Garcia, my apologies. In English, it's 0093-0309, question 1. Terribly sorry. (1309) 0093-1309.
The reference is 0093-1309.
Yes, we've got that. Please proceed.
Alors, Monsieur Maupe, en ce qui concerne...
Mr. Garcia, regarding the causes of the post-election violence, could you tell us what these causes were? And then after that, we will try to delve deeper. Answer. The root causes? I have to explain to you that there has been a great deal of discussion within the social sciences about the sources of this conflict. But I believe that in the report I mentioned there is agreement on one point, namely land tenure, land ownership. Everyone agrees on that. To explain the issue of land ownership, opinions are quite divided. But Amongst the various explanations, there are all kinds of explanations, but for example, the institutional factors that were very much stressed in the official reports produced after the crisis, in which it was explained that the institutions that emerged from the Constitution were major factors of violence. That's one explanation. And this was very much highlighted by civil society in Kenya ever since the beginning of the early 1990s. They've desperately been trying to change the Constitution, and they've really been thinking how the Constitution itself is a factor of violence. So you see, the problem is at the executive level, the imperial presidency. In other words, the executive branch of government is far too strong, and during the presidential election, the winner gets everything. And thus, the elections become an extremely high-stake game. There's too much political power, and the checks and balances are inexistent or lacking, even if the judiciary has improved under the Kibaki government. Some people did not wish to go to the courts to challenge the results of the election. That is because the executive branch makes massive use of state administration, including the police. And the police in Kenya are used in a rather odd way. For 30 years, the police has not really been there to ensure law and order, but rather to ensure political order. In other words, the police really don't handle the safety of citizens. They're there to help the people in power remain in power. One example, in 2007, the police massacred more than 500 people in Central Province, saying that they were doing away with the militia, but in actual fact they were keeping young people from voting in a particular constituency. So the state administrations are used in a particular way. The whole thing is that the ability of government and the quality of government has dropped tremendously in recent decades, and the quality of public service and it was quite good in the 60s and 70s, but the public administrations have had less and less ability to provide services. So that's one factor. Question. Yes, you did mention some institutional factors, but yesterday you were mentioning land ownership, and several times you gave us a little bit of information here and there, but take your time and please speak slowly so that the transcript will be accurate. Tell us more about the land ownership issue. What was the context at the time of the 2007 elections? Answer. Well, this is a complex, difficult issue. If I could put it this way, I would say, well, let me put it this way. Why is it that land problems occurred at some times, but not other times, in some places, but not other places? Why did it lead to violence? Why did the land issue lead to violence in some places, not all places? There are three kinds of explanations so far, three schools of thought that are competing against one another. There is a grassroots explanation. People look at the motivation of the people to understand why they resort to violence. This is a Malthusian hypothesis. It's quite simple, really. When you have strong land pressure and a lack of land, at one point, young people will use violence to gain control over land. It is a paradigm that was used a great deal to explain genocide in Rwanda, for example. So, does this apply to the Rift Valley? The demographics are there. There are a great many young people, more than 70% in actual fact, were under 27 years of age. And we know there's what you called a use bulge. There was a use bulge. So there was this strong demographic pressure, and jobs had to be found each and every year for these young people arriving on the job market in a rural area. Are there jobs in a rural area? Can an agrarian economy produce enough jobs? No, because agriculture in Kenya is structured in a particular way. 75% of the agricultural production is from small farmers, small plots of land, less than 2 hectares. You can't keep on subdividing a plot of land that's barely 2 hectares. So this can't be solved, and young people must find another way to survive, something other than agriculture. Because of the land issue or the way land is structured, the fact that there are so many small properties, small plots of land, does this explain all the violence in the Rift Valley? I'm not entirely convinced, because there are some parts of Kenya where the demographic pressure is even higher. For example, the Kisii area, or the Kisii people. Amongst the Kisii, there's a great deal of violence, but the violence is not political in nature. It is within the extended family. Why was there violence in the Rift Valley and not amongst the Kisii? Most likely because the land institutions are not the same in the two regions. And this takes me to this new approach of the land institutions. And then there's a second school of thought. This is more of a top-down explanation. And this has to do with elites and politicians. This is a paradigm of ethnic cleansing. A way of explaining things that goes like this. To win the electorate in some constituencies, some politicians cleanse their constituencies by expelling their opponents and by making land ownership a political issue. That is an explanation that has some truth to it. It provides a good explanation of the conflict in the early 1990s. It doesn't explain the motivation of people at the grassroots. Other than that, well, they have a certain interest in having some people expelled so that they can gain control of that land. It may not be an entirely satisfactory explanation. So there is a whole series of researchers now who are using a third paradigm. They say that one must look at land ownership institutions. These institutions have a structural logic that leads to political violence, at least some of them. So one must explain the two major forms of land ownership in Kenya. First of all, let me explain to you that according to all these analysts, there are two major systems of land ownership. There's the neo-customary system and then the state system. Just to make this quite clear, I need to give you some background, some history of land ownership in the Rift Valley. Yesterday, I explained that colonial powers early in the 20th century expelled from the White Highlands all the people who were living in that region. So those people were forced to migrate very far away to other regions, or they were forced to live in little reserves close to the White Highlands. And in actual fact, the ownership of the land went to the state. As of 1904 and until the late 1950s, only white people were allowed to own land. The situation, well, how was this established? How was this situation established? What happened at independence? Well, at the time of independence, you see, all this white land was sold back to the new Kenyan state. And the Kenyan state found itself with millions of hectares of very fertile land, the most fertile land of the nation. And what did they do? Well, you see, that is when there was this major division between Kadu and Kani, but in the Rift Valley between the native populations, particularly the Kalenjin, who said, we want, at the political level, we want to get our customary entitlements back, our right to the land back again.
À l'opposé, vous avez l'autre.
On the other hand, you had the other party, which was the majority party, and they said, no, we want a centralized state. We believe that the customary rights over that prime land those rights are extinguished. We are not going to come back to that. And that land has to be redistributed. Now, that is how that state system came into place. However, during the colonial period, all the other regions of the country, that is apart from the coast and the Rift Valley, in those regions, the populations were put in reservations, and access to land was regulated by the chiefs and the colonists. This is what happened throughout the rest of the country. Now, historically, how did this state land tenure system come into force in the Rift Valley? Half of those 3 to 4 million hectares were redistributed to small companies in the form of settlement schemes and land buying companies. The state directly organized the subdivision of farms belonging to the former colonists to the settlement schemes. They redistributed 1.5 million acres of land. It is true that the Kikuyus benefited quite a great deal from this, because Jomo Kenyatta, who had been the head of state ever since 1963, had a major issue to resolve within his ethnic group relating to the Mau Mau War. The Mau Mau War was an anti-colonial war, but it was specifically a Kikuyu civilian war. So within the Kikuyu community, you had explosive tensions between the former Mau Mau fighters and all those who benefited from collaboration with the powers that be and received a lot of land. So Jomo Kenyatta found solutions for this multitude of landless people in his community. He did this by opening settlement outposts in the Rift Valley. So he sent these populations, which were politically dangerous for him, to the Rift Valley. The land buying companies distributed the land to the Kikuyus, but they also distributed the lands to the Kisis, the Luos, and the Luyas. However, to be honest, the land buying companies were mainly managed by people within Kenyatta's inner circle, so mainly Kikuyus. This means that the land buying companies and the settlement schemes were very useful for the state because these were tools that the state used to control the population, particularly the population that had migrated to the Rift Valley, because there had not been distributions of title deeds for a long time, and this was done because the title deeds were kept until the loans given out had been paid back. So the central administration had control over all those populations. But despite everything, the land buying companies were a tool for skillful control of the population. In 74, Kimani managed to have 3 members of parliament elected out of 4 in the Nakuru company. He was a boss, Nakuru constituency. So he had a police commissioner who was a member of his land buying company and many other important people. So all this constituted tools for the political control of the populations. This is what made up the state land tenure system.
1 second. Before you continue, a few questions arising from that. You say that the redistribution of land that happened in the post-colonial government benefited Kikuyus greatly, and you also mentioned that lands were distributed to Kisis, Luos, and Luyas, and you stopped there. What about the Kalenjins?
Tout à fait, vous avez raison.
Answer, you are quite correct. Some of them also benefited from the settlement schemes.
I'm asking you for you to tell us. I wasn't telling you anything. I'm only mentioning so you can account for the other ethnic groups fully. Thank you.
Alors, il faut préciser.
Answer, I should point out that amongst the Kalenjin subgroups, there are a lot of pastoralists. But this distribution concerned mainly farming societies. So it is mainly the Nandis and Kipsigis who benefited from this redistribution, as well as many others. But it is true that the redistribution was not at the level that the population had expected, given the fact that this land was in its territory. Now, in 1970, we know that more than 500,000 people migrated to the Rift Valley out of a total Kenyan population of 11.4 million people. So this was a great number of people arriving in this region quite suddenly. So this was received quite badly, and in the 60s and 70s there were tensions between these new arrivals and the Kalenjin and Maasai populations, but the provincial administrations cracked down on these tensions, so the political situation did not degenerate, because the Kalenjin leaders were not acting at the political level. Why is it that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, very few Kalenjin populations had the courage to say publicly that members of their communities were frustrated? That is because they were functioning within a framework of an authoritarian regime, and the dissident voices were cracked down on. Many of them were put in prison. And another way of appeasing the elite was the redistribution of land. Half of the land.
Elite. I didn't. Please continue with that thought. Just when you say elite, which elite are we talking about? Kalenjin elite or elite in general? When you say another way of appeasing the elite.
Je fais allusion aux élites.
I was referring to the Kalenjin elite, the Maasai elite, and others. So one way of appeasing those elites also was to redistribute the 32 farms. Half of the land bought by the state was distributed to small farmers, but the other half was distributed in the form of large farms of more than 200 hectares each, and these were sold to elites of the regime. So many Kalenjin politicians benefited from that redistribution, which calmed them down a little bit. They were also given political positions. For example, it is not a coincidence that in the mid-60s, Daniel Arap Moi became vice president of the Republic. It was necessary to appease the Kalenjins, and Jomo Kenyatta felt that if Moi was the number 2 of the regime, he would be able to appease the members of his community. Now, regarding Daniel Arap Moi's arrival to power, we know that the Kalenjins were the most frustrated populations because of the land distribution. Now, in the early 80s, in order to appease those Kalenjins, Moi developed an entire series of settlement schemes for the Kalenjins. He used the forests, which is a state-owned land. And legally, the president has the right to de-gazette or redistribute the forests as he wishes. So, as from the early 80s, the forests were used as tools for patronage activities on the part of the government. Now, did the Kalenjins really benefit? Studies show that it was rather the sub-communities that benefited from the distribution of the forests. And this was paradoxical rather than the Kalenjins themselves. Now, afterwards, Moi's policy changed in the 90s because he moved on to a policy of ethnic cleansing in order to keep the control over his region of origin, because there were many constituencies there. So progressively, he made an attempt to keep a tight control over the Rift Valley. And to do that, he came up with a strategy of ethnic cleansing, targeting the migrant populations who had traveled to the Rift Valley ever since the 60s. Now, let us continue with this background. What happened when there was a regime change? In 2002, it was a Kikuyu who became president of the republic. So this was someone from a community that had been seriously affected by ethnic cleansing. So the state immediately changed the policy in the Rift Valley. He resettled at least 300,000 people who had been displaced during the massacres of the 90s. Not all of them were from the Rift Valley, but many of them were from there. So this led to further frustrations amongst the Kalenjin population because there was a return of a large number of people. Secondly, he evicted a multitude of squatters from the forest, people who had been settled in those forests by the previous government. And this affected the Kalenjins also. Secondly, there is also a land report, the Ndungu report, which states that there are more than 200,000 title deeds that were illegally allocated and had to be cancelled. But Kibaki did not heed that advice because there were banks, there were businessmen, and the argument was that the entire financial system was going to collapse if that was done.
All right. I'm sure that this question would also return, either from the prosecution or from counsel. But one more is matter you testified to also in passing that I'd like us to return to was this. A few questions ago, you speaking about the police, you said that the police were not there, were not really maintaining law and order. They were there to maintain political order, and you explained it in terms of the police not really handling safety of citizens, but to help people in power remain in power. That was your testimony. That being the case, what were people then doing? Were they left to protect themselves as best as they saw fit to do? So every man or woman for himself, protect yourself. Was that the order of the day?
Alors il faut faire ici.
Answer. It is necessary to give a background about law and order policies in Kenya. In the 80s, specifically in the cities, the police refused or rather, they were no longer really responsible for the security of the populations. Towards the end of the 80s, in almost all the neighborhoods of Nairobi, there was a lack of security because the police were no longer doing their work. And depending on the neighborhood, people came out with solutions. In the well-to-do neighborhoods, security companies were created, which represent a very important economic sector in Kenya today. Rich people live in large compounds that are well guarded by security companies. In the working class neighborhoods, it was the militias or vigilante groups which were set up by the inhabitants. And there is a neighborhood in Nairobi, Kangemi, for example, and it was the landowner who set up these groups in the late 80s with the assistance of the Catholic Church. So local bigwigs organized security groups. The problem with these vigilante groups was that depending on the neighborhood, you had vigilante groups that operated in different ways. Progressively, and throughout the 1990s and the year 2000 and thereafter, the vigilante groups started developing subsidiary activities other than security. Some of them transformed themselves into mini-mafia organizations. They controlled electricity and water supply. Some of them controlled matatu transport lines and so on. So there was a certain empowerment of some of these vigilante groups, which became autonomous from their original bosses. Initially, they were used by all political parties to provide security during their political rallies. So they became more independent from their original bosses in the neighborhoods. So this vigilante groups became progressively mafia-like, depending on the specific neighborhood. Regarding the history of law and order, one can see that the police stopped playing its role of provision of security at the end of the 80s. In fact, the police has always been understaffed. There have never been enough officers to provide security for everyone. At the end of the 80s, the police force was used rather like a political tool to regulate political order, and there were a lot of subgroups within that police force.
A related question that arises is this. In the course of evidence of witnesses, we've had testimony to the effect that reports there were during the violence checkpoints, and it appeared, according to a certain witness, that it appeared that those manning the checkpoints were expecting Mungiki to arrive. And you are an expert on Mungiki. The question is, this consideration of police not being there to protect citizens and give them safety, what has it got anything to do, any relationship with people perhaps organizing to protect themselves? They probably got wind that Mungiki were coming to town.
Alors, du fait que
Considering the fact that for decades in the towns, the communities had been used to organizing their own security, it is true that they would continue to do so during periods of political crisis. But we also have to talk about the rural areas where the situation is slightly different. Has the Kenyan government ever had the capacity to organize law and order everywhere in the rural areas? No. From time immemorial, it was the local authorities that organized law and order, and they were able to mobilize groups of young people to provide security. And in a period of crisis, those local elders are crucial factors of mobilization. Now, regarding the fear of Mungiki arriving at the checkpoints, this is something that was greatly discussed. But at the end of 2007, the Mungikis were incapable of doing anything. The Mungiki had been absolutely clobbered during the year 2007 by the security minister who had organized the massacre of large numbers of young people because they did not want, he did not want the young people to vote in certain constituencies, including his own. From March 2007 to the end of August 2007, various police forces massacred all the groups that appear to be Mungiki in the central province. So by the end of 2007, the Mungiki had very little mobilization capacity. There was a strategy on the part of the Kikuyu elite. This is just a hypothesis, but it is justifiable. Up to 2002, when the government changed, the Kikuyu elites used the militia groups to protect themselves. But once they came to power, they told themselves, look, we no longer need the militia groups. We have the police, we have the army, and in the central province, we no longer need to have strong militia groups. It was from this moment that they decided to eradicate most of the Kikuyu militia groups because those groups were very dangerous at the level of moral ethnicity. These groups were sending out protest messages within the Kikuyu community, and the government absolutely needed to eradicate those groups. So regarding the fear of the Mungiki, I think these were just rumors, because the leadership of Mungiki at the end of 2007, they were in prison.
We're about to get to the break time, but when you say rumors, what do you mean? And you say, when you started, you say that was discussed greatly, and now you say rumors. What are you telling us? The fear of the Mungiki coming to town. Specifically, from the perspective of you saying that it was discussed greatly.
il faut expliquer que
it should be pointed out that from the end of the 90s, early 2000s, the Mungiki had been known for particularly bloody massacres. They were the symbol of a group of young people cutting off people's heads and exhibiting them everywhere. So they practiced killing strategies that were designed to create fear. Now, regarding the non-Kikuyu communities and the Kikuyu middle class, there was a great fear of the bloody nature of the Kikuyu. They had become this huge monster associated.
Oui, parce que
Yes, because they were considered as a satanic group. In the 90s, the Mungiki had been part of the war against the satanic cults, and there is this idea of when you fight a group, you become closer to them. So there was that complexity of the discourse on witchcraft, Satanism, and so on. So Mungiki was characterized as the big Satan within that environment.
And you, actually, what I'm getting at is when you say rumor, that the story of Mungiki coming to town was a rumor. What I wanted to know is the nature and characteristics, or rather feature, of that rumor. Was it a rumor that was on the ground at the time? If so, where and when? 2007.
Cette rumeur.
Answer. The rumor that the Mungiki might arrive was very present in towns such as Eldoret and in many regions within the Rift Valley, insofar as well, the term of Mungiki was also used to cover Kikuyu militia. So really, it was quite a broad category, including a great many different things. And in the Rift Valley, yes, first of all, the Kikuyu militia were the same, plus these Mungiki from Nairobi, which were supposed to be particularly ruthless. But you must realize that the violence in the Rift Valley, starting in the late 1990s, the violence was somewhat special. You had the attacks of Kalenjin militia or Maasai, and then other militia would respond, Kikuyu or Kisii militia, and then you also had a process in many parts of the Rift Valley, both in 1997 and 2008, you saw the decanalization of certain villages. Kalenjin people left the towns and went to the countryside. And then the countryside saw the Kikuyu people leaving and taking refuge in the towns. So you see there was this process underway that started in the late 1990s, and it was very much present.
Very much present when?
Oui.
2007?
Et donc, ce processus est très.
The process was very present, and many militia were in the Kikuyu militia in the Rift Valley were organized as of the mid-1990s. And you must realize that Mungiki, to some extent, had its origin in these militia from the Rift Valley.
Thank you very much. We will leave it there now and come back at 2:30. Prosecutor, you will then continue. I hope the questions didn't take you off your time estimate.
Not at all, Your Honor. I still aim to finish by the end of the day.
Thank you very much. We will rise.
All rise. We will be.